President Trump has threatened further tariffs on the EU, but how far will the trade war go? Trade conflict is escalating between Europe and the US. President Trump said on Wednesday he'll impose additional duties on the EU if European countries follow through with the tariffs they've announced on American products, including bourbon, jeans and Harley-Davidsons. Those are due to kick in on the 1st of April. Well, Tim Graff is head of macro strategy for EMEA at State Street. Tim, so far these tariffs announced by Europe and the duties that came in yesterday on steel and aluminium are a bit of a rerun of what we saw in Trump's first term, aren't they? So how economically damaging do you think they'll be?
Based on what we have so far, probably not too damaging. So steel and aluminum make up about 4% of EU exports to the US. It's not an insignificant sum by any means. It's about $20 billion worth, I think. It's the potential for escalation and the retaliation that I think is the real risk here. Economically, on its own, it doesn't do too much damage, but it is that threat of uncertainty that looms over how much further this can go.
Yes, and how much further are you expecting it to go? What do you think the market assumes?
I think the market still does assume that this is negotiating tactics and that ultimately there is some negotiated solution. I think there's the potential for reciprocal tariffs, Trump has mentioned, that are probably now being seen as more likely, and this can also be quite damaging. Does the market price for a full-blown trade war of double-digit tariffs on all goods between the US and Europe? I don't think it really has yet. I don't think we're at that point.
What further action might you expect from Europe then if we see these retaliatory tariffs? Clearly, European officials thought, at least until recently, as you say, that this was a bargaining position. But will they then go for tougher options like action against tech companies, for example?
I think so. I think they might try. And there was some commentary yesterday that talked about targeting products that come from traditionally Republican voting states. It's very difficult to know exactly what that means and whether that in fact will be helpful. Europe, as the surplus side of this trade relationship, it doesn't really have a great position of strength to work from in this. They, I think, have more to lose from a trade war with the US than the US does the other way. But I do think they will take on board some of the kind of higher value add US products that do get exported to Europe as part of this, if it does accelerate. I think we need to probably go through a few other steps before we get to that point, but nonetheless, those are the avenues I suspect they would go down.
The other big story in Europe is, of course, the build-up in defence spending. There's a crucial debate in the German parliament today as the incoming government tries to push through a huge borrowing package before the new parliament convenes later in the month. But what do you expect the macro impact to be of Germany borrowing on this scale?
Yeah, I think the dynamic has definitely changed. We started this year thinking that Europe would be going through a period of monetary easing and fiscal tightening. And now what we see is certainly the opposite of that on the fiscal front. And while I suspect we won't hit the heights of some of the maximum expectations people have for fiscal spending, there has been a change. And then on the other side of the coin, the monetary policy dynamic, I think, is far more neutral, perhaps even tighter than markets were pricing earlier. And so the factors have changed that I think, absent a full-blown trade war like what we were talking about before, are much more Euro positive and European growth positive and Germany positive. Germany has the fiscal space, as we know, to enact some of the reforms to its debt brake that are being considered, or at least to spending around the debt brake on defense in the name of kind of emergencies to shore up its own needs for defense as well as those for Ukraine.
Do you think then that bond markets will be happy to buy German bonds issued at a much larger scale?
I think so. Germany's fiscal dynamics are still pretty responsible. You probably do need to see a greater term premium for longer dated German debt. I don't think that's fully priced for some of these fiscal realities quite yet. There is still, I think, a belief that Europe, as it so often does when it comes to fiscal spending, will disappoint. And I don't think they will disappoint. And that additional premium probably does need to be put into yields in the long end. But fiscal balances are pretty healthy in Germany in particular, so I do think the market will take them down, particularly as I think there will be an interest and a need for greater European safe assets to supply to markets.
As you said, Tim, we've seen already a big upside on European stocks and for the euro. Do you think the market is now priced in this spending, or could we see more?
I think in bond markets, as I mentioned before, there's potentially a little bit further to go. That also includes the currency. We track the holdings of institutional investors and their positions in the euro, and they are still very, very underweight. European stocks, on the other hand, they've already closed the big underweight that they held into Q4 last year. Their positions are back to neutral, and price has moved a long, long way. So I do feel like a lot of the good news is in the price in equities, where maybe it's not so much the price on the currency.
That was Tim Graff of State Street. Don't forget, you can watch more videos on Reuters.com.
U.S. President Donald Trump's tariff threats have now hit European wine. The president on Thursday threatened to slap a 200% levy on all wines and other alcoholic products coming out of Europe if the EU does not ditch its planned 50% tax on American whiskey.
The EU was set up in order to take advantage of the United States.
Trump reiterated that claim in a Truth Social post on Thursday and said the 200% tariff on alcohol, quote, will be great for the wine and champagne businesses in the U.S. In response to Trump's tariffs on steel and aluminum that went into effect on Wednesday, the European Commission said it will impose counter tariffs on $28 billion worth of U.S. goods next month. But European Union Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said it remained open to negotiations, adding that higher tariffs are in no one's interest.
It is not in our common interest.
About 31% of EU wine and spirits exports went to the United States last year, worth about $5 billion, according to data from the EU.
Former Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte made his first appearance before the International Criminal Court on Friday, where he faces murder allegations. Duterte spoke via video link from a detention unit. He arrived in the Netherlands from Manila on Wednesday after being arrested on an ICC warrant on charges of crimes against humanity. His lawyer said Duterte was too ill to give evidence and that his arrest and transfer to the Netherlands was an abduction.
To us lawyers, this would be called an extrajudicial rendition. To the less legally inclined, it was a pure and simple kidnapping.
Duterte's lawyer said his client was suffering from debilitating medical issues. The former Philippine leader has said he suffers from several ailments, including a chronic neuromuscular disorder and migraines. But a presiding judge responded that the court doctor, who examined Duterte upon arrival, was of the opinion that he was, quote, fully mentally aware and fit. Prosecutors have accused him of carrying out a systemic attack on the civilian population during his presidency. Thousands of purported drug dealers and users were killed during a crackdown, when death squads he allegedly created and armed carried out widespread extrajudicial killings. In Manila, victims' families watched the proceedings.
The first time that Duterte flashed on the screen, I got really emotional. I can totally say that I am happy, because how can I be happy knowing that the reason why I'm here in the first place and why Duterte's there on the ICC. But it also reminded me that this is the result of all the calls for justice.
Duterte is set to be the first Asian former head of state to go on trial at the ICC. A confirmation of charges hearing has been set to start on September 23rd. A trial would not be expected to start until early 2026.
Top Senate Democrat Chuck Schumer signaled he'd vote to advance a Trump-backed Republican stopgap funding bill Thursday in order to avoid a partial government shutdown. The bill to keep federal agencies funded past Friday sailed through the Republican-controlled House of Representatives on Tuesday. Schumer said Thursday his party would provide the votes to avoid a shutdown, doing so grudgingly, as many Democrats have said the bill shortchanges social safety net programs.
Republicans' nihilism has brought us to the brink of disaster. Unless Congress acts, the federal government will shut down tomorrow at midnight. I have said many times there are no winners in a government shutdown, but there are certainly victims, the most vulnerable Americans who rely on federal programs to feed their families, to access medical care, and to stay financially afloat. I believe it is my job to make the best choice for the country to minimize the harms to the American people. Therefore, I will vote to keep the government open and not shut it down.
Up until Wednesday, Schumer had said his caucus was unified in not letting the bill pass the Senate. In a last-minute gambit, Schumer earlier called for a one-month extension of existing spending that aimed to provide more time for appropriators to complete their funding bills for this year. But Democrats are unlikely to have the votes to pass such an amendment, even if it is allowed to be voted upon. Blocking the Republican bill that was passed by the House on Tuesday would have required the support of at least 41 of Schumer's Democrats. If that were the case, one Republican senator told Reuters, it would lead to, quote, 100% a Schumer shutdown. Democrats' wariness of a shutdown comes at the heels of Republican President Donald Trump's rapid-fire campaign to unilaterally shutter many federal operations, which Democrats say has caused disruption. Congressional brinksmanship, including repeated near misses with shutdowns and over the nation's $36 trillion in debt, has led to global ratings agencies downgrading the U.S. federal government's once pristine credit rating.
I, Mark Carney.
Former central banker Mark Carney was sworn in as Prime Minister of Canada on Friday amid threats of U.S. tariffs that could devastate the economy. He succeeds Justin Trudeau, who had a combative and often cold relationship with U.S. President Donald Trump. Carney said he looked forward to speaking with Trump when the moment was right.
We respect the United States. We respect President Trump. We'll both be looking out for our countries, but he knows and I know from long experience that we can find mutual solutions that win for both.
He had this to say about talk from the Trump administration about annexing Canada.
It's crazy.
Friday caps a momentous rise for Carney, who became the first Canadian Prime Minister without any serious political experience. He was previously the head of the Bank of Canada and later the Bank of England. Carney crushed his rivals in a race to become leader of the ruling Liberal Party and replace Trudeau, who spent more than 9 years in office. However, he will likely not be in the post for long. Canadians must head to the polls by October, though Liberal insiders say Carney will call a snap election within the next 2 weeks. If he doesn't, opposition parties say they will unite to bring down the minority Liberal government at the end of March. Opinion polls currently suggest it will be a close race with the official opposition Conservatives, with neither party gaining enough seats to form a majority government. Carney said he would visit London and Paris next week, as Ottawa continues to shore up alliances in Europe.
With respect to the president, I don't have plans to go to the United States. I look forward to speaking to him at the appropriate moment. We respect the United States. We respect President Trump. President Trump has put some very important issues at the top of his agenda. We understand the importance President Trump places on American workers and American jobs. We want him and his administration to understand the importance we put on Canadian workers and Canadian jobs. And we will look for avenues to work together so that both objectives are met in terms of both our great economies, just as we are doing, and the people behind me have led this, just as we are doing with respect to the scourge of fentanyl. President Trump and I, though, we share some experiences. I have been in the private sector. I have worked in the real estate sector. I have done large transactions. I have worked with him during his first presidency at the G20, at the G7. I respect what he is looking to accomplish. We'll both be looking out for our countries. But he knows, and I know from long experience, that we can find mutual solutions that win for both.
After fleeing sectarian killings to a Russian airbase, these Syrians are returning home, some to devastated villages. Falak Isa is one of the thousands who fled to Russia's Hamameim airbase after violence swept Syria's coastal region last week when predominantly Alawite towns and villages were attacked.
What happened is all kinds of shells, bombs, machine guns, all kinds of weapons. We were terrified, truly terrified.
The violence spiraled after Syria's Sunni Islamist-led authorities said their security forces were attacked by militants loyal to ousted President Bashar al-Assad, whose Alawite family come from the coastal region. The attack unleashed widespread killings targeting Alawites. Hundreds were killed, marking the worst bloodshed since Assad was toppled in December after 14 years of war. Reuters journalists saw homes and shops torched and looted, and villages largely deserted during a visit to the coastal region on Thursday, in which they were accompanied by government security personnel. Interim President Ahmad Sharaa, a former al-Qaeda leader, has promised to punish those responsible, including his own allies if needed. Rana Boushai and her family left the Hamamim airbase on Thursday with an escort from government security forces. Her brother encouraged her to go home, telling her the situation was calm, but she said others were too scared to leave.
Honestly, there is fear. Of course, there is fear, but God willing, things will get better in the future. We are very hopeful that things will improve.
Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said on Thursday that about 9,000 people were seeking refuge at Hamamim. A Syrian government security official said there were 1,500 people sheltering there. Russia is trying to build relations with the new Syrian leadership. But the future of the Hamamim base and Russia's naval base at Tartus remain unclear.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has expressed qualified support for a US proposed 30-day ceasefire in the Ukraine war. But he says any agreement must address what Moscow sees as the root causes of the conflict.
We're doing very well with Russia.
A major caveat that suggests agreement could take longer than US President Donald Trump wants. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, whose country has accepted the plan, says Putin wants to delay the truce or make it not happen at all. So what do we know of Putin's conditions for pausing the war prompted by Russia's invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago? Russia wants Ukraine to drop its ambitions to join the US-led NATO military alliance.
NATO welcomes the aspirations of Georgia and Ukraine for their membership in NATO.
In February, Russia demanded NATO scrap its 2008 promise to one day give Ukraine membership. It also dismissed the idea that NATO forces could keep the peace under any ceasefire deal. Putin portrays the conflict as part of an existential battle with the West, which he says humiliated Russia by expanding NATO eastwards after the fall of communism. The Kremlin wants recognition of Russia's claim to Crimea and 4 Ukrainian provinces it controls. It annexed the Crimean Peninsula in 2014 and sent proxies into East Ukraine. Russian forces currently control nearly a fifth of Ukraine's territory and are edging forward. Keir Giles of Chatham House says Ukraine accuses Russia of trying to create a frozen conflict.
The cementing of the front lines in their current position without any long-term guarantee of ensuring that the war will actually come to an end risks rewarding Russia by making the current zone of control permanent and freezing the conflict in place as opposed to resolving it.
Kyiv says Moscow annexed the regions it claims illegally and that it will never recognize Russian sovereignty over them. Putin wants the size of Ukraine's army to be limited. He says the ceasefire would have to ensure that Ukraine didn't use the time to regroup, train and take weapons deliveries, something Russia could also do.
Russia will be rebuilding its military force even faster without Ukrainian forces eroding it almost as fast as it can be rebuilt. And Ukraine, of course, will be rebuilding its defenses.
Both sides are sustaining heavy casualties in what has become a war of attrition. But Russia is currently in the stronger position, experts say, while the future of US aid to Kyiv remains unclear under Trump. A February report by the London-based IISS think tank said Ukraine has suffered a serious loss of personnel, with many ground units under strength. Kyiv has launched a military recruitment drive to address its manpower problem. The Kremlin has also previously demanded an agreement not to deploy foreign troops in Ukraine. Putin has also made clear he wants Western sanctions on his country eased, and a presidential election to be held in Ukraine, which Kyiv says is premature while martial law is still in force.
Iran has publicly rejected the US's offer of negotiations over its nuclear program, but for the country's clerical leaders, hammering out a new deal with the US and easing sanctions may be the lesser of two evils. Despite a deep distrust in the US, Tehran is increasingly concerned that public anger over economic hardships could erupt into mass protests. That's according to Iranian officials, who also say that behind closed doors there's a willingness to strike a new deal with Washington. Officials are concerned about cutting off all diplomatic avenues. They fear it might further fuel public discontent against Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. President Masoud Pezeshkian has also repeatedly expressed anxiety about the economy, stating that the situation now is more challenging than during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s.
It is a step away from the specter of conflict.
Iran's weak economy pushed it to back the 2015 nuclear deal, leading to the lifting of Western sanctions and an improvement in economic conditions. But President Donald Trump pulled out of the agreement in 2018 and reinstated US sanctions.
Can't let them have a nuclear weapon.
Now he wants to renegotiate the deal to prevent the country's development of nuclear weapons. In order to force Iran's hand, Trump has now introduced new sanctions on Iran's oil industry as part of his so-called maximum pressure campaign. But Khamenei has publicly rebuffed Trump, saying Iran will not be bullied into negotiations. Iran's rulers are also facing a string of other crises, including energy and water shortages, a collapsing currency, and growing fears of an Israeli strike on its nuclear facilities. The Iranian rial has shed more than 90% of its value against the dollar since sanctions were reimposed in 2018, and official inflation hovers around 40%. What's more is that based on Iranian state media reports, there were at least 216 demonstrations across Iran in February. The protests are largely focused on economic hardships, including low wages and months of unpaid salaries, according to the reports. Iran has staved off economic collapse largely thanks to China, the main buyer of its oil and one of the few nations still trading with Tehran despite sanctions.
Ethiopia and Eritrea could be headed towards war, officials in northern Ethiopia and regional experts have warned. Such a conflict would signal the death blow to a historic rapprochement between the two longtime foes. And it would also risk creating another humanitarian disaster in the Horn of Africa. Eritrea, a former Italian colony, was annexed by Ethiopia in 1962. Rebel forces led by now-President Isaias Afwerki waged a 3-decade armed struggle that secured Eritrea's independence in 1993. The two countries had initially warm ties, but clashes broke out in 1998 over ownership of a disputed border town. An estimated 80,000 people were killed in the subsequent 2 years of war. The two countries remained formally at war until 2018, when Isaias and newly appointed Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed agreed to normalize diplomatic relations and rebuild economic ties. The warnings of conflict stem from fresh instability in Ethiopia's northern Tigray region. A civil war there between 2020 and 2022 led to hundreds of thousands of deaths. During the war, Eritrean forces crossed the border into Tigray to fight in support of Ethiopia's federal army against rebels led by the region's ruling party, the TPLF. But a peace deal signed in November 2022 drove a wedge between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Eritrea, analysts say, was not happy at being excluded from the negotiations which allowed the TPLF, with which Eritrea remains deeply hostile, to govern the region. According to the US, some Eritrean troops have remained on Ethiopian soil despite the deal calling for the withdrawal of outside forces. The TPLF, which runs Tigray's post-war interim administration with the blessing of the federal government, has since split. A dissident faction seized the town of Adigrat this week. It accuses those in power of selling out Tigrayan interests. Tigray's interim administration accuses the dissidents of collaborating with Eritrea. Each side denies the other's allegations. Experts say the standoff could lead to Ethiopia and Eritrea backing rival camps in Tigray and ultimately coming into direct conflict. Eritrea ordered a nationwide military mobilization in mid-February, according to a human rights group. Diplomatic sources and Tigrayan officials have told Reuters that Ethiopia has deployed troops towards the Eritrean border. Eritrean and Ethiopian government spokespeople have not responded to requests for comment. Eritrean officials have also bristled at repeated public declarations from Abiy since 2023 that landlocked Ethiopia has a right to sea access. Many in Eritrea, which lies on the Red Sea, view that as an implicit threat of military action. Last October, Eritrea signed a security pact with Egypt and Somalia that was widely seen as aimed at countering Ethiopia's potential expansionist ambitions.
Russian President Vladimir Putin said on Thursday that he was open to a U.S. proposed ceasefire in Ukraine, but said many issues still needed clarification and that any truce would need to address what he called the root causes of the conflict. A day earlier, Moscow presented the U.S. with a list of demands to end its war in Ukraine, including preventing Kiev from joining NATO, ruling out foreign troops in the country, and recognition of Russian sovereignty over 4 provinces it claims to have annexed. Earlier this week, American and Ukrainian officials agreed to an immediate 30-day ceasefire, and U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that Russia's response to the offer would say a lot about Moscow's true intentions.
So we hope to have a positive answer from them. The ball is truly in their court.
Donald Trump had said in the White House on Wednesday that he hoped the Kremlin would agree to end what the U.S. president called a bloodbath.
And hopefully we can get a ceasefire from Russia, and if we do, I think that would be 80% of the way to getting this horrible bloodbath finished. It's a bloodbath.
Putin thanked Trump for his efforts to end the war and said he might call Trump to discuss the issue. If Putin's answer seemed diplomatic, Kremlin aide Yuri Ushakov was more blunt when asked about the U.S. proposal for an immediate truce.
A temporary ceasefire, what does it give us? It gives us nothing. It only gives the Ukrainians an opportunity to regroup, gain strength, and to continue the same thing.
Putin sent tens of thousands of Russian troops into Ukraine in 2022 in what he called a special military operation, triggering the largest military conflict in Europe since World War II and the starkest confrontation between Moscow and the West since the end of the Cold War. After severe setbacks early in the invasion, Russian forces have been advancing since mid-2024 and control nearly a fifth of Ukraine's territory. And they seem close to completely retaking a piece of Russian territory in Kursk that Ukrainian forces captured last summer. In a sign of the Kremlin's growing confidence, Putin donned a military uniform for a visit to his commanders in Kursk on Wednesday and told them to finish the job, quote, in the shortest possible time frame. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff is in Moscow Thursday to meet with Putin to further discuss the proposed ceasefire.
A California judge has ordered the Trump administration to reinstate thousands of recently hired employees who were fired. It's the most significant blow yet to the effort by President Donald Trump and his advisor Elon Musk to drastically shrink the federal bureaucracy. The ruling applies to probationary employees at 6 U.S. agencies, the Departments of Defense, Veterans Affairs, Agriculture, Energy, Interior, and the Treasury. The judge ruled that the Office of Personnel Management had improperly directed those agencies to fire workers without having the power to do so. He said, quote, "It is a sad day when our government would fire some good employee and say it was based on performance, when they know good and well that's a lie. Probationary employees in general can only be fired for performance issues." The White House and the other agencies did not immediately respond to requests for comment. The ruling came on a deadline day for government agencies to submit plans for a second wave of mass layoffs. About 25,000 workers across the U.S. government had been fired as of March 5th, according to a Reuters tally, and another 75,000 have taken a buyout.
Armenian and Azerbaijani officials said on Thursday they had agreed to a draft of a peace agreement to end the nearly 4 decades of conflict between the two nations. The two post-Soviet South Caucasus countries have fought a series of wars since the late 1980s. After Nagorno-Karabakh, a region in Azerbaijan with a mostly ethnic Armenian population at the time, broke away with support from Armenia. Peace talks began after Azerbaijan retook Karabakh by force in September 2023. It prompted almost all of the territory's 100,000 Armenians to flee to Armenia. Most now lived there as refugees. Although both countries' foreign ministries announced the text agreement was ready to sign, the timeline is uncertain. Azerbaijan says Armenia must first change its constitution, which it says makes implicit claims to its territory. Armenia denies this, but Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan has said repeatedly the country's founding document needs to be replaced and has called for a referendum to do so. Here's Pashinyan on the draft agreement.
First, let us confirm that the negotiations on the text to the agreement on peace and the establishment of interstate relations between Armenia and Azerbaijan have been completed with the agreement on the text, which in my opinion is an important event.
Russia's TASS state news agency cited Pashinyan, saying the agreement would prevent third countries' personnel deploying along the more than 600-mile Armenia-Azerbaijan border. Both sides have said they wanted to sign a treaty to end the long-running conflict, but progress has been slow and relations tense.
Mr. President, Greenland. What is your vision for the potential annexation of Greenland and getting them potentially
Well, I think it'll happen, and I'm just thinking, I didn't give it much thought before, but I'm sitting with a man that could be very instrumental. You know, Mark, we need that for international security, not just security, international. We have a lot of our favorite players, cruising around the coast, and we have to be careful. And we'll be talking to you. It's a very appropriate, really a very appropriate question.
There's an issue in the high north, so the Arctic. So what you did, so when it comes to Greenland, yes or not joining the US, I would leave that outside for me, this discussion, because I don't want to drag NATO in that. But when it comes to the high north and the Arctic, you are totally right. The Chinese are now using these routes. We know that the Russians are rearming.
But that whole area is becoming very important, and for a lot of reasons, the routes are, very direct to Asia, to Russia, and you have ships all over the place, and we have to have protection. So we're going to have to make a deal on that.
Today, we are together.
European Union leaders announced an investment package worth €4.7 billion, or $5.1 billion, during a visit to South Africa on Thursday. Both sides are on worse terms with the United States than they have been for decades. US President Donald Trump's administration has slashed aid to South Africa over its efforts to address historic racial land injustice. It has also interposed itself in Europe, criticising it for isolating the far right and ignoring voters' concerns about immigration. And it has pivoted towards Russia in the Ukraine war.
Like what's happening in Gaza.
Trump's staunchly pro-Israel stance has also brought him into conflict with South Africa over its genocide case against Israel at the World Court. At talks with European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in Cape Town, South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa said his country valued European support for multilateralism at a time of rising nationalism.
Global uncertainty, which we spoke a little bit about in our tete-a-tete, which is characterized by rising unilateralism, economic nationalism, and a retreat from what we've always wanted to advance, which is adherence to international law.
The EU trip was an opportunity to improve ties, which soured when South Africa refused to outright condemn Russia's Vladimir Putin for invading Ukraine. Von der Leyen said Europe wanted to help the South African economy grow.
So that is what I call a true mutual interest.
United Nations experts reported on Thursday that Israel committed genocidal acts against Palestinians by destroying women's healthcare facilities and using sexual violence as a war strategy during the conflict in Gaza. Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, rejected the report's findings, calling them biased and anti-Semitic. The country disengaged from the Human Rights Council in February. Chris Sidoti, is a member of the UN Independent International Commissions of Inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territory.
Our report finds that Israel has increasingly employed sexual, reproductive and other forms of gender-based violence against Palestinians as part of a broader effort to undermine their right to self-determination. It also concludes that Israel has carried out genocidal acts through the systematic destruction of sexual and reproductive healthcare facilities.
Those actions, in addition to a surge in maternity death due to restricted access to medical supplies, amounted to the crime against humanity of extermination, the Commission said. The report accuses Israeli security forces of using forced public stripping and sexual assault as standard practice to punish Palestinians after the 2023 Hamas-led attacks on southern Israel. During hearings in Geneva this week, a Gaza nurse identified as Saeed said that Israeli forces kidnapped him and forced him to strip to his underwear in public. During his captivity, he was beaten in the genitals, he added.
Now, this is physical abuse, but it's also psychological abuse. It's designed to humiliate. The Commission documented a pattern of sexual violence, including cases of rape and other forms of sexual violence, torture and other inhumane acts that amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity.
A previous report published by the Commission in June 2024 accused Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups of serious rights violations in the October 7, 2023 attack. Hamas carried out a cross-border raid into southern Israel on October 7, 2023, triggering a devastating war in the Gaza Strip that killed more than 48,000 Palestinians, according to Gaza health officials. Hamas militants killed 1,200 people and took 251 hostages, according to Israeli tallies. South Africa has brought a genocide case against Israel's actions in Gaza at the International Court of Justice.
South Korean military investigators on Thursday charged 2 Air Force pilots with criminal negligence causing bodily harm for accidentally bombing a village during a training exercise. The incident injured at least 29 people and caused extensive property damage. The Defense Ministry's Criminal Investigation Command said the pilots' errors in entering coordinates were direct factors behind the accidental bombing. 8 unguided bombs from 2 fighter jets hit a village in Pocheon during live-fire exercises. The area features training grounds used by the South Korean and U.S. militaries. A ministry official said that the 2 pilots have been removed from flight duties, and a review of their certification is scheduled. The Air Force Chief of Staff apologized last week and pledged to review procedures to prevent future incidents. North Korea, which often criticizes South Korean and U.S. military drills, said the accident highlighted the risk of conflict, noting the bombs could have dropped north of the border. An investigation into the incident is ongoing.
As of now, there are no assurances. A U.S. judge on Monday ordered that Palestinian student Mahmoud Khalil not be deported for now. Khalil had been a prominent figure in Columbia University's pro-Palestinian student protest movement last year. Just hours after telling Reuters that he was concerned the government was targeting him, Khalil was arrested Saturday night by U.S. Department of Homeland Security agents in front of his wife, a U.S. citizen who is 8 months pregnant, according to one of his lawyers. His arrest comes amid a crackdown on some of the student protesters by U.S. President Donald Trump, who branded Khalil a, quote, radical foreign pro-Hamas student on social media and said more arrests would follow. After his arrest, Khalil was moved to a federal jail for migrants in Louisiana to await deportation proceedings, according to his lawyers and a U.S. detainee database. New York Southern District Court Judge Jesse Furman has ordered a hearing in the case for Wednesday. Khalil's lawyers also urged Furman to order their client's return to New York. They accused the government of seeking to deprive Khalil of access to legal counsel by sending him far from the state. On Monday, demonstrators on the streets of New York City denounced his arrest as an attack on protected speech. Release Mahmoud Khalil now. According to a Reuters witness, police and hundreds of protesters briefly clashed in Lower Manhattan, and at least one person was detained.
We're here because a permanent resident living here in our city was kidnapped by ICE, part of the DHS, and they're trying to deport him because he's exercising his freedom of speech and his right to speak out, which is protected for everyone here, be they a citizen or not.
Khalil had held legal permanent resident status, often called a green card. His wife said the DHS agents that arrested him claimed his green card was revoked. However, it would entitle him to legal protections that may have been violated in his arrest, says immigration attorney Cyrus Mehta.
Highly unusual because Mr. Khalil is a green card holder. Green card holders have rights. They just cannot be picked up in the way he has been and detained incognito. The person should have been convicted of a crime, a deportable offense. I don't believe Mr. Khalil has been convicted of such an offense, from what I know. You could also initiate deportation proceedings if a green card holder has provided material support to terrorist organization, which is what the Trump administration has been alleging.
Mehta added that in such cases, the government has a high burden of proof, and that involvement in protests for Palestinian rights would not typically constitute material support to terrorism. The Trump administration has not said whether Khalil has been accused of or charged with a crime. However, Trump wrote that his presence in the U.S. was, quote, contrary to national and foreign policy interests.
Russia has given the US a list of demands for a deal to end its war against Ukraine and reset relations with Washington. That's according to two people familiar with the matter Wednesday, though specifics were unclear. It comes after Washington had proposed a deal for a 30-day truce to break up the conflict between Kiev and Moscow that followed Russia's invasion of Ukraine in early 2022. The sources said Russian and American officials discussed the terms in detail for the past 3 weeks. They described the Kremlin's terms as broad and similar to demands Russia previously presented to Ukraine, the US, and NATO. Those earlier terms include no NATO membership for Kiev, no deployment of foreign troops in Ukraine, and international recognition that Crimea and 4 provinces belong to Russia. On Tuesday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said he would agree to a 30-day truce as a first step toward peace talks, while Russian President Vladimir Putin's commitment to such a potential deal is still uncertain. The Trump administration has not explained how it is approaching its negotiations with Moscow. The two sides are engaged in 2 separate conversations, one on resetting US-Russia relations and the other on a Ukraine peace agreement. The administration appears to be divided on how to proceed. This all comes as Russia's defense ministry claims to have retaken territory held by Ukraine troops in Kursk in western Russia. Ukraine says its soldiers will keep operating in Kursk as long as needed and says its troops are fighting in and around the major town of Suja.
Dozens of people rescued from a train hijacked by separatist militants in southwestern Pakistan arrived on Thursday in the city of Quetta. That was hours after security forces killed all 33 attackers to end a day-long standoff. Insurgent group Baloch Liberation Army, the largest of the region's armed ethnic groups battling with the government, claimed responsibility for the attack, which left 21 hostages and 4 security troops dead. The militants blew up rail tracks and opened fire on the train on Tuesday as it made its way to Peshawar from Quetta, the capital of mineral-rich Balochistan province. Several of the 440 train passengers were taken hostage. Surviving hostages requiring medical treatment were transferred to a hospital in Quetta. Muhammad Tanvir told Reuters that he was returning home from Afghanistan when the attack happened.
The situation was terrible. We didn't eat anything for 2 days. Our last meal was at sunrise, and after that we survived only on water. We even had to drink water from the train's washroom. Then last night our army arrived. By evening they had cleared everything. They gave us protection, served us food and water, and took care of the situation.
Another hostage, Aslan Yusuf, told Reuters that the militants grouped the passengers by their region of origin.
They kept shouting, "We will kill anyone who doesn't come out." Then things took a darker turn. They began checking everyone's ID cards. Punjabis, Sindhis, Baloch. They separated us into groups. Sometimes they took soldiers outside and executed them. Other times they targeted specific individuals. If they had a grudge against someone, they shot him on the spot.
Hundreds of troops, special forces, and military helicopters joined the effort to free the hostages, who were stranded in remote, mountainous terrain. The Baloch Liberation Army had threatened to start killing hostages if authorities didn't release Baloch political prisoners, activists, and missing people it said had been abducted by the military. The group says the government denies the region its fair share of the benefits from its mineral resources. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif said on social media on Tuesday that such cowardly acts will not shake Pakistan's resolve for peace.